Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Rudy Rivera. Today, I have the honor of having with me two distinguished guests of international fame on the subject of case studies. How often haven't you been to a doctor and the doctor will tell you, there's a case study on this, and we've shown that 50% of people who took this had positive results. There's even case studies on people who have a positive attitude do better in their diagnosis. I'm happy to have with me two outstanding people in the field. Sharon Batt is a writer, researcher, and activist with a focus on health ethics, including patient advocacy groups, the politics of health knowledge, and the regulation of pharmaceuticals. She has a PhD and is currently an adjunct professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Canada, and Georgetown University in DC, and part of the advocacy group Independent Voices for Safe and Effective Drugs. We also have Núria Homedes, who studied medicine at the Autonomous University of Barcelona and specialized in internal medicine and preventative medicine at the University of Barcelona, Spain. She received a doctorate in public health from the School of Public Health at the University of Texas Houston Science Center, where she joined the faculty in 1997 and was a founder and co-director of the Global Health Program from 2005 until she retired in August of 2018. Dr. Homedes has worked as a consultant for the World Health Organization, USAID, PAHO, the World Bank, and the governments of Colombia, Mexico, and Zambia on issues related to health systems and human resources. She is a member of the executive board of the International Society of Drug Bulletins and has been a member of the editorial board of several international health and ethics journals. Currently, she is executive director of Salud y Fármacos. Welcome. Thank you for coming. The first question is, can you tell our audience what is a clinical trial?
Well, it's a study involving patients that's designed to determine whether a particular treatment is effective and safe. So that's a kind of a little thumbnail.
But Núria, what does it consist of when they say it's a clinical study? I mean, I know there's all kinds of studies, but like in the medicine for treatment, what does it consist of?
The clinical trials are considered to be the best methodology to prove the effectiveness of a medicine, and so, or a pharmaceutical or any type of intervention. It can be also used, it's a methodology, so it can be used for behavioral interventions as well. But in the area of pharmaceuticals, which is our focus, what the sponsor of the clinical trial will do is they will assign people to either receive the treatment group or the standard treatment or a placebo. So you at least have to have two groups, the experimental treatment and another group that will be either the standard treatment in the best scenario, but often they use placebo. And they will compare the results among the groups at the end of the trial, say 6 months, a year. They will see who is doing better, those who have received the experimental drug or those who have received the standard treatment or the placebo.
And so you don't know if you're getting the real drug. You don't know if you're getting the placebo. They're not going to tell you that, right?
No, you don't know it, and your physician doesn't know it either. This is done blindly by a third party because what you want to get is objective information. And there is fear that if the patient or the physician knows what treatment is the patient receiving, they might change their attitude and they might record better outcomes than they actually have. So it's to avoid any type of bias in the reporting of the results. So that's why very often you'll see double-blind clinical trial. Double-blind means exactly that, that neither those who conduct the trial or the patient knows what intervention they are receiving.
But Sharon, how does somebody get recruited into, or Dr. Batt, how does somebody get recruited into this?
You can call me Sharon.
They call you doctor. They don't call lawyers doctor unless I'm in Ecuador or some other place. But well-deserved degrees. How do you get recruited into a clinical study?
Well, I was in a clinical study actually quite a long time ago when I was a breast cancer patient. But your physician would recognize that you could be a candidate for that trial and would invite you to be in the trial and would explain what the trial was about. It should be informed consent. I mean, that's one of the ethical criteria, is that the patient should know what the trial is designed to do and the risks and potential risks of being in the trial, because there usually are risks in being in a clinical trial. And then, as Nuria said, you don't know if you agree to be in the trial. You don't know whether you're going to be in the study group or the experimental group or the control group.
But how do the doctors know about the criminal trial? There obviously must be a whole lot of recruiting going on and incentives so that the doctor can say, hey, try this criminal trial. For me as a lawyer, I'm thinking that could present an ethics issue. If you're benefiting from a patient going to a clinical
clinical.
clinical trial, okay, clinical trial, then shouldn't that be disclosed also?
Well, nowadays, there are also other methods that are used for recruiting. Sometimes you can see it in the buses. We are recruiting women of such and such age to participate in this clinical trial. You can also see it through Twitter or mass media. This has become very, very broad. And I would say that, yes, I think there is a problem when your primary physician is the one running the trial, because whoever runs the trial makes money per patient that they enroll in the clinical trial. And that information, it's not often disclosed. They don't say. They might, at the maximum, what I have seen is that the informed consent will say the physician or the principal investigator and the institution where the clinical trial is run will receive some money or will benefit in another way, but they don't add any details. And sometimes the amount that the physician gets per patient enrolled is very high, meaning like for a clinical trial on vaccines in the early 2000s in Argentina, the physician was getting $350 per every child enrolled. For a physician in Argentina, that was a huge salary. You have to enroll 5 patients and you have already made your monthly salary, basically. This physician, or the sample size for this clinical trial, was 17,000 kids. So there was a huge incentive to enroll patients, sometimes with inadequate.
But to do that, though, I mean, that's an ethical. I think that. Yeah, you froze up a little bit. But again, I go back to, isn't that an ethical? I think an ethical violation for you as a physician to tell your patient you should enroll in this clinical trial, and then he or she doesn't disclose that they're getting paid for this. Because the motivation is, do you really care about my health, or do you care about making $350?
There is that lack of transparency. It has been signaled as a as an ethical problem by many of us. But we have not been able to change the rules. There was a country in Latin America where the chief of the regulatory agency for a while made it mandatory to put in every informed consent that it was a human experiment, because that's what it is. We call them clinical trials, but actually it's an experiment on human beings. So he did that, and he also requested the contracts so that the IRBs could revise the money that the principal investigator was going to make, precisely to detect if the quantities were too high to induce the inscription of patients that maybe didn't fulfill the inclusion criteria or the exclusion criteria. But that didn't last. Actually, this particular director of the regulatory agency, the equivalent of the FDA here, was sacked from the ministry, and he learned it through the media. The hypothesis is that the pharmaceutical industry got angry at him, not only because of that, he had also run a special study on that vaccine clinical trial and was able to document that there were failures in informed consent and in the inscription of children who didn't qualify for the clinical trial, and that pharmaceutical company and that principal investigator were fined. But that's very unusual. Usually, even if there are ethical violations, in most cases, they go unpunished. There is no consequence for the clinical investigator or for the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry may miss some cases because obviously if they discover that there have been an undue inducement or the data have not been collected appropriately, they will have to eliminate those records from the clinical trial and they have to re-enroll more. But those effects are negligible compared to the violations that sometimes are seen.
I just wanted to just mention, Nuria mentioned that there are now other ways of recruiting patients, for example, through patient advocacy groups or, Facebook, or a lot of countries now will list the clinical trials that are ongoing in that country. So, if you have, say, diabetes, you can go online and at your health department, and it'll list the ongoing trials for diabetics. So there are different ways of recruiting patients now, and I think they all have their potential problems.
Well, Sharon, let me ask you this, though. If you went through a clinical trial, I'm going to stop that. You went through a clinical trial. Did you feel that they were transparent with you? That there was transparency there?
I don't know. I still don't know to this day, and it never occurred to me to ask whether the researchers were being paid, a lump sum for recruiting me, and I kind of wish I'd known that. One of the things that I think is true in many cases, when you're diagnosed, the question of whether you go into a clinical trial happens quite quickly. So I was diagnosed with breast cancer. I'd never been sick before in my life, seriously. I was in my early 40s. And within a couple of weeks, I was asked by my physician whether I would agree to go into a clinical trial. I mean, I was still reeling from just learning that I had this disease. And I was, I wasn't a journalist. I was used to doing research, but I was scrambling to find out as much as I could about the disease, about clinical trials. So you're being asked to make a decision quite quickly in many cases when you've just been diagnosed and you don't. It's really hard to absorb all the the questions, to know what questions to ask, to just to really understand what you're getting into. And I think in my case, it came to the fact that I was at a hospital that was quite well regarded. I'd been told that my physician was a trustworthy person, and I basically decided to trust him in the process. And I think it was probably a very ethically conducted trial. But it's very hard to know those things when you're a patient.
I don't think you're ever going to know, and it's going to be difficult for these clinical trials to make an objective decision, especially if you've got something that could be quite serious. You feel, diagnosis is really just a guess, right?
Not
so-
always, but
Huh?
Not always.
A lot of times it's a guess. I mean, doctors go through the process of elimination. If one thing doesn't work, maybe something else will work. And obviously, sometimes they hit it right on the money. Other times they don't, and they keep trying. One of the things that, just moving on with this subject, one of the things that really concerned me, especially with what I've seen on the internet about these clinical trials, that the data is not necessarily reliable, that studies have been fabricated. In one instance, there was a doctor in Amsterdam who actually made up subjects and said, these subjects said this. How do you guard against something like that? You have all these medical journals that are supposed to review this information, and don't they have some kind of quality assurance or quality standard that they site check, they check the data? Cheryl, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go with Nuria.
well, I think it's becoming more and more a topic of concern that you see, in the literature, and that's being talked about, that, that there are these problems of, how do you trust what's even in the literature, even in high quality journals. There have been instances of trials that were later revealed, and sometimes this is revealed through court cases, information that comes out in court cases, that the trial was, there's this term called a seeding trial, where the trial was really intended to promote a new treatment as opposed to actually answer a scientific question. But then there, that's sort of an extreme, but then there are other trials where it's kind of mixed. I mean, there's some financial or some incentive on the part of the industry. The industry is, say, paying for the trial. And it's, so some of the investigators are from the industry, and some of them are from, an independent, a university. And, to really distinguish whether the outcome of that trial is, or the features of that trial are up to scratch is quite difficult.
Well, Robertson Mall did a study, or did research, and they looked into about 800 published medical research papers, and a high percentage of them had flaws. Go ahead.
Yeah.
How can this happen?
Well, there are the issues, I think, are
many. There are many.
Many, and they start by the design of the trial. So it could be that some of the problems that he identified were not actually that the physician was making up, or the principal investigator was making up patients, but it could have been that the trial was poorly designed from the very from the get-go. The industry has recognized it. They are interested in making money. So they are going to design clinical trials that would yield, or that are likely to yield, the type of results that they want. And so now there is people that have already unveiled some of these problems, and the regulatory agencies and the IRBs and the other people who read the trials might be smarter at identifying those things. but it's really, really difficult, and you require statisticians and people who have their very up-to-date knowledge in pharmacology, research designs. Now that they are changing so much, there are very few experts on those things. So that's one problem. Then when it comes to implementing the trial, actually the industry has interest in having the data collected according to the protocol, and they hire companies, the CROs, that are supposed to supervise the accuracy of the data. And they have clinical trial monitors that go to their research sites, and they make sure that what's on paper really reflects what's being done and what the pharmaceutical company wanted to see. And there are cases that we know in several countries of Latin America where the physician had made up patients, but it was the industry who discovered it, because the industry knows more or less how many patients a given physician will be able to enroll. And if they enroll many more than those, well, that's already a red flag, and they will go and they will do an inspection in addition to all the other regular inspections. So I would say that the industry makes an effort to make sure that the clinical trial is implemented as they had intended, because otherwise they have to throw out some of the data. But then there is an additional problem, and that is that not all the clinical trials get published. And only those who yield results that are positive have a better chance of being published. And that's the reason why now the regulatory agencies in virtually the entire world are requiring that the sponsors of the trial register the trial and the design of the trial before they start recruiting patients, so that they can make sure that all the trials end up being published, whether they are positive or negative, because otherwise we don't learn anything from the clinical trials that are negative, and it's a high percentage that are negative. So there are tweaks that have been done to try to avoid that high level of fraud, as if you want to call it that way. And so now we have systems to verify that all the trials get published. But the other issue is, does all the data get published? Because there is also a tendency to publish the data that favor the results that the industry wants, and they don't publish as much about the side effects or negative effects that may come up during the trial.
Well, when somebody is presenting the result of a study in a clinical trial, should they produce with that the raw data so that somebody can check it? And that's mostly the case. The raw data is not there. And in a number of articles I've read where they've been asked for the data, oh, my computer crashed. That's the modern day excuse of the dog ate my homework. So that's not available. And then what I've also read is that some false studies produce other false studies, because other studies are relying on the results of the previous study. And do you see that happening there?
Well, yeah. Let me recoup my thoughts.
Just one point, you've mentioned IRBs and CROs, and I think we need to be careful that we explain what those kinds of terms mean.
Yeah, could you explain those? Especially for me.
Well, the
IRB is like an ethics board. Like every clinical trial, it's supposed to be overseen by an ethics board, and they go by different names. We call them research ethics boards. In the States, they tend to be the institutional research boards.
Institutional research board, yeah. IRBs. There is a movement called RIAT that puts a lot of emphasis in trying to recuperate the data from the clinical trials, from the original clinical trials. The Cochrane Foundation has also tried to do that. So the Transparimet is another NGO that's working on transparency in clinical trials, and it's following up on everybody that doesn't publish the results of the trials. So there are some regulatory agency, Canada and the EMA in Europe, have made the original data, individual data available. The problem is that reproducing the analysis that the industry has done is costly and very time consuming. So we don't have enough people that are able to do all of this. And it still takes a lot of energy for those groups to be able to access the data. Oftentimes they have to go through open records. And so there is a lot of paperwork. There is a movement also that requests that the editors of medical journals request the individual data, because the truth is that unless you have the data from all the individual participants, it's very difficult to detect fraud. And so that's why we have so many publications that are useless. It's because neither the editors nor the peer reviewers are able to see what has been done with the data. Another issue that to me...
Go ahead. The trend, though, is that if you publish an article and you do not have the data in which you can verify it, then it's not considered trustworthy, as they say, because it hasn't been substantiated. It's more or less anecdotal. Well, this is what we know, but we have nothing to back it up, right?
Well, I think we have lived within a system of trust where we have been trusting those who present the data. I mean, all those problems with the clinical trials, I think, have increased as the participation of the private industry has also increased. It used to be that it was public institutions or universities that were doing the clinical trials. Now it's more in the hands of the private sector. And the private sector has a right to keep the data for themselves. It's their data. So we are now reacting to that reality. It's like, okay, it's not totally your data because we are going to be using your medicines and paying for them. So it's important for us to know. And so we are going after those things in a slower pace. One thing that people may not be aware, but that's based on industry data, only around 10% of the molecules that are tested in human beings end up being approved by the pharmaceutical agency. By the regulatory agency.
I mean the agency, not the pharmaceutical companies, right?
By the regulatory agency, not the pharmaceutical companies. So let's say 10 molecules are tested. 10 molecules are tested. Only one will end up being approved by the FDA or other regulatory agencies around the world. So very often those who participate in clinical trials think that they will benefit because this treatment is newer. But the truth is that there is not that much innovation. There are many clinical trials ongoing, but very few of those end up being successful.
So what's the benefit, though, Sharon, to somebody like you? What's the benefit, as to going into a trial with those low percentage numbers? Again, it goes back to you're in a sad state because you've been diagnosed, right? And you figure, what do you have to lose? But those are really depressing statistics.
Well, I think most patients wouldn't be aware of that. One of the things I've been interested in my research is the way the way patient activism has kind of contributed to a shift in having drugs approved more quickly. And this goes back to the AIDS activists who were very desperate and pushed the FDA to approve more drugs more quickly. And that actually contributed to a big shift in the way agencies like the FDA operate, because there were, patient advocacy groups saying, look, you're too slow. And that contributed to the agencies kind of changing some of the rules. And that continues to the present day. I mean, I think the AIDS activists became more and more savvy as they became more aware of how things worked and began to say, well, yeah, we want the drugs. We don't want drugs just approved because we're desperate. But, we want very efficient, a very efficient system. But I think there are a lot of groups now, and I do, this is one of the focus of a lot of my research is patient advocacy groups and the pressures that they put on agencies like the FDA to approve a drug because they're desperate and they do assume that the new drugs are going to be better. So I think there's a lot of misinformation or misconceptions or kind of a mixture of hope and desperation. And, and a lot of the patient advocacy groups now are well funded by the pharmaceutical companies, and they receive a lot of their information from the pharmaceutical companies. So it's disturbing and kind of ironic that the patients who are supposed to benefit, they're supposed to be the ultimate benefits of clinical trials and clinical research, are contributing to a system that is probably not in the best interest of the patients.
Well, I think with the advent of the internet and people can fact check more, there's a lot more information out there, which again could be harder to even absorb because there's so much of it now. But even if, a question I have for both of you though, even if, of the 10% that's approved, how much better is what's approved than the old medicine?
Not a lot.
So is that just a way to extend a patent so you can keep the drugs from becoming generic? Nuria, I see you have a big smile with that. I know you have something good to say about it.
No, I wanted to say that only between 8 and 12% of those that end up being approved by the regulatory agencies really add some therapeutic value. The rest are no better than drugs that were already in the market. So I do see how a patient that has a very bad diagnosis, a serious cancer or something like that, where there is no standard treatment and there is no hope, well, anything goes. Some people opt for having good quality of life, the months that I have left, and other people would say, I'll go to any clinical trials. I know friends of mine who have been hoping from one clinical trial to another clinical trial because there was absolutely no treatment for them. And they were fully aware that their chances of benefiting from the trial were very, very, very low. But they still chose it. What I think it's a little bit more questionable is if there is a standard treatment that it's pretty effective and it doesn't have very serious side effects, then the risks of participating in that clinical trial, to me, they are a little higher because you already have a good treatment. And okay, I said that only 10% of the products that are tested in humans end up being approved. But actually, this is from phase 1 to phase 3. but most of the clinical trials that enroll a large number of patients are phase 3. So out of these phase 3 clinical trials, 50% of the molecules will end up being approved, more or less. Some people would say 40, some 60, and it depends a little bit on the specialty of the drugs, but around 50%. So you have a 50% chances. But even if it's approved, you only have an 8 to 12% possibilities that this will be better than what you would have received anyway. So do you want to run the risk?
Well, with people encouraging you to go into it, you're getting treatment. It's really, I think it's a tough decision to say, well, what, I mean, is somebody going to say to you, for example, is your doctor going to say to you, I think your treatment is fine. I recommend you don't go into this new clinical study, because we don't know if it's going to be better and the medicine you have is working fine. How often does a doctor say that?
I don't know. That's very difficult to say, and I wouldn't venture.
Well, based on what you know anecdotally, I know there are no stats on it, but you see the point. If the doctors or people are incentivized to get you into these studies, then, and you're saying to me, some of the medicine you're taking is better, don't go into the study. You know, who's there to protect the patient on that?
Well, in theory, the IRBs, the institutional review boards, or the ethics committees, they are the ones solely responsible for protecting the participants in the clinical trial. Now, a typical IRB has to have at least 5 members. Many of them have more than that, say 9 or 10. But those IRBs are approving all types of studies, from student thesis to clinical trials that with clinical devices or with surgeries, different techniques of surgeries. How are you going to find an IRB composed of 5 to 10 people who has experts in all the areas that they are supposed to review? That's very difficult. And it really, in my experience, in the IRBs in the US and the ones I know from Europe and from Latin America, I just did a study in 9 countries of Latin America. The IRBs are very scarce in resources. They all do their work as volunteers. Yeah. It's difficult to get real experts, especially statisticians and experts in pharmacology, to come and join the IRB because they have better things to do. And so sometimes one could argue that the IRBs are facilitating research, and rather than protecting the participant in the clinical trial, not because they want to. They actually believe that they are protecting the participant, and they wish they were able to do that. Those are volunteers. Usually it's people with a very good heart. It's just that the task is too big for those small groups. The ethical review is very, very fragmented. Each hospital has its own ethical review. Now, for the last, I don't know if it's 10 or 15 years, there has been a growth in what I call commercial IRBs, but those are private IRBs that were created just to review clinical trials and approve them. And in the US, there is one that in its website, it says that they control the clinical trials that are done in 3,500 medical centers. Well, that to me is a little dangerous. First, because those IRBs make their money based on the revision of the clinical trial protocols. So the industry is very interested in accelerating that review because they are very interested in getting the product to market as soon as possible.
Well, and that brings up another question, though. But before we get into that, though, we have a question for Sharon, and that is, can you describe the role of pharma-funded patient groups in recruiting trial participants and what ethical issues this raises? And also, can you comment on the regulatory environment governing these activities?
Well, there's really, one of the things that concerns me is that there's really no regulatory oversight of the patient advocacy groups. So as I said, a lot of them are receiving a proportion of their funding, sometimes all of their funding, from the very companies that are making drugs for their condition. So they're going to want, there's an incentive for them to encourage their members to go into clinical trials that are being sponsored by the company that is sponsoring the group. So that's problematic. I mean, and I think that's something that's evolved in the past 10, 15 years, where patient advocacy groups have become quite instrumental in the whole recruitment process. And they really, they kind of fit with the whole concept of, let's get these drugs approved, and patients. I mean, I see patient advocacy groups suggesting to patients, well, this is a way to get access to a new drug. And they're not being told, well, the new drug may not be any better than the old drug, or it may even be worse. And there's a risk going into a clinical trial. I mean, people do occasionally die in clinical trials taking a new drug that, you don't know whether it works or not. So I think that the involvement of patient advocacy groups in helping to recruit for clinical trials has added an extra ethical concern.
Well, and there could be serious conflicts of interest with that, especially if you're being funded by the pharma companies and they're pushing that.
Yeah.
We have another question. Can you tell us about the role of the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Humans? ICH is how the clinical trials are made and how the criminal trials are made.
I think that's more for Nuria. I mean, I know a bit about it, but maybe not enough.
Well, the Conference of Harmonization tries to do that, harmonize how the different regulatory agencies are going to approve the new medicines. So it has become, they have standardized all the process of data gathering throughout the clinical trials. So they are a very powerful institution. They were created, I think, at the beginning, it was basically the FDA, the regulatory agency of Europe, EMA, and the Japanese regulatory agency, and then some pharmaceutical companies. But they are very important in all these games. Now, they are not necessarily protecting the participant. What they are doing is coming up with methodologies for collecting the data, for running the clinical trials. And they are huge. They have a huge influence.
Well, Sharon, what's your thought on that? I know you said you had something to say about it.
Oh, well, I mean, I think the FDA has always been, or historically has been, the kind of the main regulatory agency globally. There are other important regulators, but I've done a research paper recently asking what's wrong with the FDA, what needs to change at the FDA, and a lot of people have flagged the fact that the standards have changed at the FDA. It's not looked up to in the same way that it used to be. So if we're harmonizing towards the standards at the FDA, they're not always going to be the best standards. I mean, we should be, if we're going to harmonize, it should be to the best standards. And that could mean deviating or trying to strengthen the standards. And I think that's not what the harmonization process is always doing. One of the things I want to raise is the whole thing about the costs of drugs. I mean, when I was first diagnosed with breast cancer, the drugs were, for a given patient, it would cost, maybe $1,000, $2,000 a year to treat that patient. Now it's up to tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, or even there are a few drugs that are over $1 million per year to treat a single patient. So when you start approving drugs where you're not really sure how valuable they are, how effective they are, I mean, that's really problematic from the point of view of having a good healthcare system that's able to, use its resources effectively. And I think that's a big part of the problems we're getting into with clinical trials that are approving drugs that may not be any better than, say, the older, less expensive drugs, or, they may turn out to be ineffective and need to be pulled from the market.
Well, I think there's a study by Barber in college, I believe, that said of the 194 journal articles they've read or they've analyzed, 21% of them are geared towards marketing. So you have, is the ultimate purpose of the clinical trial to eventually market something that may or may not be better. So, you have the lack of transparency in selecting people. Then you have the problems with people falsifying data. And now you have an article that says, oh, by the way, this is the best thing since, the aspirin, let's say. And I think what's dangerous about that is that doctors who believe these studies will then rely on that to prescribe certain medications for people. That's to me, is the most dangerous part of all of this thing.
Well, and not only the physicians who read the studies, there are systematic reviews or meta-analyses that try to put together all the data from the different clinical trials that have been done. And those are more widely read, and those are the ones that are used to develop the clinical guidelines. And we know that people who have developed clinical guidelines and some of these meta-analyses or systematic reviews have included clinical trials that are fraudulent. And so that's a big problem, because you kind of, that fraud that occurred during 1 or 2 or 3 clinical trials, if they carry a big weight in the meta-analysis and they are taking on to the clinical trials, that means they affect the health of everybody that has this type of disease, right?
And there's more than one person that have studied these trials, and they all say the common thread is that 30% at the very least are either fraudulent, or the data is insufficient, or data doesn't say what they said it says.
Yeah.
That's I think the problem in relying on a clinical trial, and who's doing it.
Yeah.
But Sharon, something you said about these advocacy groups, that they try to have, they have a good heart, but I tend to be more suspect about that. People often shout, we're not for profit, but they really make a lot of money. And some of these people in these not-for-profit entities make a lot of money. I've seen it on the GuideStar reviews. They can make $1 million a year doing that. So it's
several,
even it's still a business in the sense. And that's what people need to, I think, take to that, is just because they're an advocacy group doesn't mean they're not in the money-making business, or doesn't mean that they don't have an agenda to pursue.
Right.
And would you recommend to somebody who's going to be talking to an advocacy group to do their homework on that group?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm part of a group, full disclosure, called Independent Voices for Safe and Effective Drugs, and we don't take any funds from pharmaceutical companies. And there are a number of organizations that don't, but the majority do now. I think the studies have shown that take some money from pharmaceutical companies, and it's hard to do your homework on it. I think you should, but they don't all disclose. There's no rule. There's no law saying that they have to disclose how much money or whether they're even taking money from pharmaceutical companies. So that's a whole kind of a black box area that's needs to be worked on.
In the
Doesn't
US,
open payments require open payments in the US? Doesn't it require?
Not patient advocacy groups. Physicians need to declare, but not the patient advocacy groups. There are some of the European countries, and in Canada, there's a voluntary disclosure on the part of the drug companies to say which groups are giving money to, but that also isn't very well. It's not all that trustworthy.
Mm-hmm.
well, one of the things people can check is GuideStar of the US. So GuideStar is a report on non-for-profit entities. And I don't know how, it's been years since I've looked into GuideStar, but they do provide some information on the source of funds for these not-for-profit groups, because they're required to file they're still required to file returns with the government.
Yeah.
Even though they don't pay taxes. And in my mind, sometimes not-for-profit is just a way not to pay taxes and make a lot of money, because what they really do is it's a business, they just happen to be exempt from taxes. So at the end of the day, what we're looking at is a system that is not transparent, full of a number of flaws, that we really don't have a solution. And if we did, it would be very difficult to implement because of so many parties involved. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah. Generally speaking, yeah. I mean, and it's really important because, people's lives depend on what we think we believe or what we think we know about whether drugs work or not and how well they work.
I don't think anybody really, I mean, what I find that it is difficult to trust because there's so much misinformation out there. It's so many levels that you become so overwhelmed. And somebody, I guess, can be like a snake oil salesman.
Yeah.
This is the wonder drug, because based on some of these studies, I believe that were flawed. They were giving children injections or mothers injections prior to the baby being born. Now they say, no, you can't do that because the studies were fraud. And it becomes even more complicated when it comes to women's health, Sharon. There were some articles on that too. Yeah.
Yeah, the whole question of whether women are involved in clinical trials has been a big one, especially women who are pregnant or lactating. Initially, there was a feeling, well, those women shouldn't go into clinical trials because there might be danger to the baby. But then you have, women who are pregnant or lactating who have a particular condition, and they want to know, well, should I be taking this drug? There was a question with the vaccines, the COVID vaccines. Initially, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Nuri, I don't think initially they included pregnant women in those trials.
I don't remember, but I remember there were affirmations made that having received the vaccine wasn't going to affect the newborn, when in fact they didn't know. It had not been studied that happened. I like to put a plug a little bit for the International Society of Drug Bulletins, because although there is all this information that sometimes it's hard to trust, there is an international organization, the International Society of Drug Bulletins, which is made out of bulletins that analyze the data produced by that the industry has, or the individual data, and they have bulletins that can orient users on whether that treatment is better or worse than an older one, or these type of things. I consult with them constantly. In the US, where Spills Best Pills is run by Public Citizen, and yes, you have to pay a little bit a year to receive the bulletins, but it's like $12 or $15. And you have the advantage that then you can go to their website and check any treatment that you want, and you get independent information. At least that's what I do. In Canada, Therapeutics Initiative does the same. In Europe, there are probably 20 groups that are doing that. We at Salute Pharmacos, we translate information that is available in English or French for the Spanish speakers. And so those are the sources of information that I use when I require some information on medicines. There are other.
Esprit in France, that's a good reputation too.
Yes,
when you start working in the field, you start to trust. There are certain sources that you feel you can trust more than others, for sure. But for the average person, that's,
know that. It's just like me, lawyers. I can tell you, I think, which lawyers are good or bad, and I can still be mistaken. But the average person is not going to know. I think that's an interesting point. You know, there was something, I want to close with this one thing with our LinkedIn audience. Basically, there's a guy named John, I believe his name is John Carlisle, and he talked about zombie studies. And he refers to zombie studies that basically they have a semblance of real research, but closer scrutiny shows that they were actually hollow shells masquerading as reliable for information. And he was surprised by the amount of zombie research. And even if these research projects that get published or get rejected, they end up getting published anyway in other journals. Maybe that aren't so, yeah. So I guess the moral of the story is don't believe everything you read, right? Don't believe anything you read. Well, I want to thank my LinkedIn audience for attending. I think it was a great session, even though I used the word criminal instead of clinical, but I picked it up, you know. It goes to show no one's perfect. I'm going to stop the streaming now. Don't forget, you are watching Conversations with Rudy Rivera.